Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to VadimChess. Today we're going to be talking about how to beat the Englund system, okay? And the Englund system is a pretty popular system, especially under 1400. And when you look around on YouTube, there aren't really a lot of good videos that detail how to play against it. Today we're going to be examining what happens after d4 and e5 and how you can beat it. Okay, first things first, obviously, as soon as you get this, you're going to take on e5, and sometimes people will play d6, and in this case, you'll just take, and you'll play up a pawn. Yes, you're going to be a tempo behind in terms of development, but you're going to be up a pawn, so there is no real compensation here for black. White is actually a little bit better, and let me turn on the engine so you guys can see what I'm talking about here. The engine says it's plus 0.9, so black doesn't really get any benefit from sacrificing a pawn, and you're just going to develop like normal. Now, the critical parts of the Englund Gambit isn't from d6, but from queen e7, and after knight f3, knight c6, and the order of these moves doesn't matter at all. But here you're going to play bishop f4, and this is where the critical kind of line begins. So, your opponent has queen b4, you're going to drop your bishop back to d2, otherwise you're just going to lose it. He's going to take on b2, he or she, and you're going to play knight c3, okay? And from this position, we encounter the first and only sort of deviation, or I guess fork in the road, where your opponent has two moves. He can either play bishop b4 or knight b4. Okay, let's start with knight b4 because it's a little bit less common, and I actually don't see a lot of people talking about this, but this is very, very dangerous. For example, if you play rook b1 here attacking the queen, you're actually going to immediately lose after knight takes c2, where you end up losing the queen. Okay, so after knight b4, you have to be very accurate with your moves, and instead you're going to play knight d4. Okay, now what does knight d4 do? It protects c2, and it's going to allow you to play rook b1 on the next move. So here, most of the time, your opponent's going to play c5. It's the most natural move, trying to kick this knight out. It's very important here that you don't move this knight, because once again, you will run into knight takes c2, where you have to sacrifice your queen and lose the game. And instead, you play rook b1, challenging this queen. So if he was to take your knight, you'll be able to take his queen. The queen's going to go a3, and here you're going to take this knight that's on d4 and put it on b5. So now you can move the knight freely, because the queen from a3 does not support c2. So knight takes c2 no longer works because of queen takes c2. And so instead of doing the sacrifice, your opponent's going to have to respond by playing something like queen a5. And against queen a5, you can respond with knight c to d5, okay? And this is a very nice move for a couple of reasons. Let's take a look at black's options. If your opponent was to try and take this knight on d5, he would end up losing his queen. So naturally, that's not possible. And if your opponent was to take this knight on b5, you have knight c7 check, and it's also a fork. Not only are you forking the king and rook, you're also forking the queen. So wherever your opponent goes, king d8, you're just going to take the queen, and you're going to be completely winning. Okay? And so taking this knight is not possible. Taking this knight is also not possible. And both of these knights are looking at knight c7 check. At this point, your opponent's probably going to go to king d8 in order to stop knight c7 from being a check. So if you go knight c7 here, I mean, this is still good, but I mean, you could honestly get away with this. That's how good your position is. It's just not the most practical line. After rook b8, you can go e4, and even though you don't technically win any material right away, your position is so much more active that this is still completely winning. However, there's a more practical way of doing this, and it's to play e4 right away. Now this knight on b5 is protected. This bishop is opened up. And after your opponent goes somewhere like a6, you can just go to d6. If your opponent trades this knight off, you undouble your pawns. Take a look at this position, okay? Your opponent can never castle. Both of your bishops are incredibly active. This knight is in a lot of danger. Your opponent's queen is basically the worst piece on the board. And if your opponent does something like queen takes a2 here, which is pretty silly, bishop takes b4, c takes b4, knight takes b4, your opponent is just in a terrible position here. You can play queen d4, and at this point you're looking at g7. Your knight is protected by both the rook and the queen. Let's say your opponent goes f6. That's okay. Bishop c4. Your position is so much more active, okay? Your opponent has absolutely nothing here. He cannot develop this knight, so let's just say he goes to h6. You're going to castle. You're going to go knight d5 or knight d3, and you're going to be much, much better here. So even though you don't directly win material, you're incredibly more active. Your opponent's king is your opponent's weakest piece. As you can see, your opponent can no longer castle. And so if we were to just go through an example line, for example, let's just say b6, because your opponent wants to play bishop b7, you can go, I mean, bishop d5 here even, and after something like rook b8, you would already have knight d3, b5, c4. Obviously, your opponent cannot take this pawn because of losing the rook. So if something like b4, then you would have rook a1 attacking the queen. I mean, you're just literally harassing this guy's pieces. Queen b6, c5. This game is basically over. I mean, at this point, queen b5, rook f to b1. This is resignable. And I know I keep saying you're so much better here, but I'm not really showing you guys why you're better. So let me demonstrate this at this point. And by the way, it's very unlikely that you're going to face this exact line. There's no point in memorizing this, but I'm just demonstrating how the activity that you have, which is so much better than your opponent's, is going to help you win this game. Your opponent literally has no good moves here. Like, let's say he plays rook e8. You have rook takes b4. This queen is trapped. This queen is literally trapped, and he has to go queen takes e3, queen takes e3, rook takes b4. You win the queen and a pawn for the price of a rook and a knight. You're obviously, that's a very positive trade. You can just go queen a3 here. You're looking at queen a5. I mean, it's very close to checkmate. Rook b5, for example, bishop c4. This rook doesn't really have any moves. If he was to go to b7, queen a5 is mate in 2. Your opponent has to go either rook b6 or rook c7. That's the only legal move, and then you have checkmate. So you're going to be winning material in these cases. So that is kind of what I was trying to allude to, is that you have enough activity to completely dominate this game if you just take a second and see the tactics that can basically lead you to a win. But essentially, if your opponent does everything right and doesn't lose any material, you're still going to be completely winning. Like I said here, it's a +5 position. Even if he takes this a2 pawn, you're going to be completely better. So that covers this entire knight b4 idea, where your opponent jumps in and tries to go for this knight c2 plan. I've actually seen someone at a almost 2100 rating try this line. So clearly, this is still something that you're going to run into, and it's a very legitimate concern unless you know how to play against it. But the most popular line, which is what you're going to face the most, is definitely bishop b4 here. And against this, you can respond very calmly with rook b1. After queen a3, you actually have multiple options. A lot of people play knight b5. A lot of people play rook b3. Rook b3 is very, very decent. After queen a5, you can play something like e4. Again, you just have an incredible lead in development. Knight e7, a3, force out a trade. You're going to be more active here. I mean, this is a great position. But I prefer to play, instead of rook b3, I prefer to play knight d5. And this basically forces the trade of bishops. And if your opponent takes on a2, you can just go rook b to d1. Again, you're down a pawn, but your position is so much more active. You're threatening c7, and your opponent's really only response to this is to play king d8. Of course, he can play rook b8 and, you know, still allow knight takes c7. I don't know why he would do this. But after king d8, you would have a simple knight b5, and not only is the material equal again, you're just going to play e4 on the next move, but also your opponent can no longer castle, and your pieces are far better developed. So instead of this, your opponent's probably going to play king d8. You can play e4 here, bishop e2. If your opponent goes queen a5 and offers a trade of queens, you would want to avoid it ideally, because you don't really want to trade any pieces in a position where your advantage comes from activity. So in this case, you would play something like c3. If your opponent tries to trade, that's fine. You just undouble your pawns. And again, I don't need you to memorize all these moves. You need to just memorize all the way up until knight d5, bishop takes, and then rook d1. This is literally as far as you need to go. And then you just need to understand the principles. You're threatening c7, so your opponent has to respond to that by playing king d8 or something like that. And then you're going to play e4. You're going to develop like you normally would. You're going to castle. You're going to want to avoid major trades because your advantage lies in the fact that you're better in terms of development. And so if you trade major pieces off, the gap between you and your opponent's development diminishes, and you're not going to have as much of an advantage. And then you can just go knight g5. All of a sudden, the fact that the king is on d8 actually creates a new weakness in f7. And so you don't need to memorize this exact line because it's very unlikely that it's going to happen. But understanding these moves and how you can convert your advantage is very important. So for example, you can go bishop h5 here. If your opponent goes g6, you have queen d4. You're already threatening this rook. The fact that your opponent hasn't really developed is what's holding your opponent back, right? That's why you're able to play moves like this. So you can go queen g7 here, and if your opponent takes the bishop, you have knight takes h7. Now you're threatening the rook with 2 pieces. Something like rook g8 doesn't work because of knight f6. And if your opponent plays knight g6 to protect this rook, then you just have rook f to e1, and you can win this this piece. And at this point, this game is completely winning for white. I mean, you don't need to be fucking Albert Einstein to see that this is a completely dominating position for white. And like I said, the chances of you facing every single one of these moves in the way that I showed you is very unlikely. You're probably going to deviate at some point. Maybe you're going to forget. Maybe your opponent's going to play something else. After you play e4, he might play, I don't know, knight h6. Again, even knight h6, you have queen g5, you know, king e8, queen takes g7. You're going to be completely winning. So you don't need to learn every single possible move that your opponent can play. All you need to know is these two lines with bishop b4 and knight b4. And once you learn that knight b4 just met with knight d4, and then you're going to play rook b1, knight b5, and then knight d5. I mean, this game is practically over at this point. And against bishop b4, all you need to remember is that you can start with rook b1 right away, and then you can play knight d5. And if you forget knight d5 and you play rook b3, that's completely okay as well. You're still going to be winning. Even if you don't play either of those moves and still play something along the lines of knight b5, that's still going to be better than what your opponent has, because your position is very forgiving, okay? You're a much, much better position than your opponent, given the fact that your opponent is playing such an inferior opening. So all you have to do is just remember that you have a big advantage, develop like a normal person, and then strike on your opponent's weaknesses, which in most cases is going to be the fact that this king cannot castle, and you can attack it with both of your knights, such as knight g5 ideas, the knight d5 ideas with knight c7. All of those things are going to be very helpful for you. Ladies and gentlemen, this sums up everything I wanted to show you guys on how to beat the Englund system. As you can see, it's not a very difficult system whatsoever. A lot of people like to overcomplicate it and make it seem scary. It's really not. You can just do what I showed you guys in the videos, and you're going to be winning every single one of your games against the Englund. As always, thank you everybody so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Maybe leave a comment, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.
Daydream, I fell asleep amid the flowers.